Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for logging in for our webinar today. My name is TJ Cantwell, and I'm the Executive Director at the NCCCO Foundation. At the NCCCO Foundation, we are working to improve the load handling industry through research, education, and workforce development programs. Today, we'll be discussing why certification, and licensing are not the same and how to ensure you're meeting the requirements. We'll conduct a short Q&A at the end of today's presentation. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the chat window or the Q&A box. We will address as many as possible at the end during the Q&A session. You have all been muted, and please note that today's webinar is being recorded. By the end of our time today, we hope you will feel more comfortable and confident about the differences between certificate, certification, and licensing, and have a starting point for reviewing your current practices to ensure you are meeting your requirements. Our featured speaker today is Mr. Tom Sickelsteel, the Chief Executive Officer of the National Commission for the Certification of Crane Operators, CCO. As the third generation of a family that brought cranes and lifting equipment to the Pacific Northwest, he has more than 35 years of experience in the crane and rigging industry. In addition, he holds several positions on committees within ASME, including recently being appointed as the B30 Committee Vice Chair. Mr. Sickelsteel, thank you for joining us here today. Please go ahead and share your knowledge with this eager group.
All right, thank you, TJ. Appreciate the introduction. Appreciate the time here as well. So we'll go ahead and jump in to the webinar here. So this is a little bit of my background. TJ already covered that, so I'm just going to kind of briefly move off, show that and move on. So learning objectives for today are to talk about the qualification requirements for the roles on a job site with cranes, understand the differences between certificate, certification, and licensing. It's really the focal point for us. So before I begin on that, I do think it's important to state that there are rules, regulations, and standards, but there are ones that go beyond that. And so sometimes you'll get more defining standards through site supervision, controlling entity. Different localities will have it, different states may have it. Good examples of that are like New York City. New York City has completely some standards that are really different than the rest of the industry. California is a good state that has a different policy. Washington State has different policies, and Pennsylvania, some other places do. So as we talk about those, I'm not really talking as we go through this presentation. I'm not really focused on the specific areas like New York City and that sort of stuff. We are aware of those, but I'm really focused a little bit more on the OSHA and the industry standards that we'll have. And so again, site supervision can be also have more restrictive policies and requirements and stuff. So just as an overview from OSHA, and this will be interesting as time develops here with OSHA, but OSHA, about once a generation, they come out and with an update and with a plan. And so they've come out with stuff in 2010 and 2018, they updated a little bit of it. But generally at that point, OSHA doesn't really rewrite a lot of rules or those sort of things. However, plan states, so the ones in red, kind of continue to make legislation and that sort of stuff. As a minimum, it has to be at least as effective as OSHA. But there's many cases where the state plans start trying to go beyond that. And so areas where they have done that is actually, some have defined construction as maintenance. Some have defined a crane in a different way. Some have defined the qualifications of rigger, signal people, and AD director all in different ways. And so those are areas, if you're in a state planned state, especially if there's been regulations that have been promoted within that state, those will be areas to keep in mind as well. And as we go forward, over the next couple of decades, the states will continue to become different. from OSHA. They will continue to have new regulations and grow that. And so that's one thing to watch. The other one is the industry standard. And so ASME is the industry standard for the crane industry. The standards are updated. Some are updated every 3 years, some are updated every 5. But the cool thing is that they respond to questions and inquiry, and they do meet very consistently, and it is an industry consensus document. Often in our safety contracts or in our contracts with customers or those kinds of things, there is a statement that says you will meet the industry safety standards. Well, for the crane industry, ASME is really the crane industry standards. And so within that, it has a whole bunch of different regulation or different standards that is set. So you can see here the latest and greatest dates of publication of some of the standards. And you can see also that they address different types of cranes, as well as like below the hook devices, slings, and those kinds of things. So those are things to keep in mind as you have different types of equipment, as you have different requirements. And these are all bringing the industry standards. They all have things talking about personnel qualification within them and those sort of things. The crane industry is pretty unique because most industry safety standards don't start out with roles and responsibilities. And in the ASME world, there is a bunch of roles and responsibilities that are really defined on there. The nice thing about ASME, it's not just a construction standard. It's not just a general industry standard. It is the standard for all, and it covers all places. So you don't have to get into jurisdictional disputes or those kinds of things. It's really the industry safety standard for the entire industry. So the qualification levels that we wanted to go over today, there's going to be license as well, but we wanted just to kind of start out with some definitions of some core levels here. So there's competent level, qualified, and then certified. And so in ASME, they use the term designated on occasion, and that does mean competent as well. But all of these different levels have different elements to them. So let's dive into the discussion or the definition of these. So for a competent person, this is basically someone who has the authorization to take prompt corrective measures to eliminate hazards. So they can identify the hazards, they can predict the hazards, but they have the authorization to take prompt corrective measures to eliminate them. So it's not, a lot of times people think competent means that they have experience or they have years of knowledge on something. It doesn't mean that. It means that on the job site, who has the authority to make prompt corrective measures and decisions to eliminate hazards. And so that's a really important definition to have. And again, that's for competent. Qualified is another level. So it means that someone who has successfully demonstrated that they understand the ability to solve and resolve the subject matter, the work, or the project. So how do you successfully demonstrate? Well, most of the time that's done through a test. And this is where OSHA gets into, if you have a qualified person, they start being able to determine how did you successfully demonstrate that they're qualified, especially if there's an accident or an incident that occurred after their demonstration of qualification. And so it's really important to have that. How did they demonstrate the ability to solve and resolve problems? So again, most of the time that means a test. So a certified person, this is under OSHA, and it's the 1926. It's one of the first ones that they have related to a national recognized third party where they provide the information. So one of the ways that that's nationally recognized is through ISO 17024. ISO is the International Standards Organization. And so what happens often with the certified side is it gets a little convoluted sometimes about, because everyone says, well, there's a certification and there's this certification. And what does it mean? Under OSHA, it means that they're nationally recognized third party, and then they meet these requirements here. So what is ISO? Let's talk a little bit first about what is certification. So certification is non-governmental entity. So if it gets to government, that's more of a license, that's more of something else. Really, certification here is a non-governmental entity, and it's a time-limited recognition. ISO says up to 5 years is kind of a good thing, but at that point, you have to like renew your certification. You have to reestablish all of that. So, and what do they look for? They look for criteria for proficiency or competency. So, some of that is through additional hours that they may have in some learning that they may have, or it might be a retest that happens every 5 years. But it's continually looked at, and so it's not like a driver's license where you pass the test once and then you only have to do other stuff. There is some revalidation of they've met the criteria for proficiency or competency. It's a really important point. Certification also says that when you have a certification that this person meets the required competencies to practice that. And it talks about the required competencies that have to continue beyond that certification. So it's an ongoing thing. Knowledge, skills, attributes are all the things that it's measuring. So the focus of any certification is really on the evaluation and comparing that to a job task analysis. And so they create a job task analysis and say, if I'm able to do all of these tasks and I'm able to do them competently, then I have met certification equivalency. So that's where that really happens. Often there is a written exam type thing. There could be an oral exam. There could be a practical exam. There could be an observational exam kind of thing that happens. But really with certification, they have to demonstrate those competencies somehow, and they have to meet the threshold that's been determined as far as job task analysis. So ISO is a big deal because probably a lot of people are familiar with like an ISO 9000 or some kind of management process thing. This is in the same body, but it's just a different segment, and it's dealing with the personnel certification side. And so again, tests in these things are built from a job task analysis. So what is that person going to do, and how are we going to test it? It's really important also that there is no conflict of interest. Often people with incentive, so that could be like training providers with incentive to pass people or that sort of thing, are generally excluded from any of those processes. The exams have to be fair, reliable, and valid, and that's where they always come back to. You get a 5-year approval of a accreditation under ISO, but every year you go through 2 audits. You go through a internal audit, and you also go through an external audit, and in our case by ANAB, and that external audit really focus on psychometric things. So what is psychometrics? Psychometrics from a crane guy. So psychometrics are things where you analyze the value of the question, you analyze the performance of a question, and you analyze how that compares to people who are passing the exam versus people who aren't passing the exam. Are people choosing the distractors? Are they choosing the right, different elements? How often are they choosing the key? And so there's a lot of analysis that goes in that. And they want to make sure that if you have different modalities, that they are definitely performing the same. You don't want to have someone that takes it on a computer be able to more easily pass the exam than someone with paper pencil, and vice versa. What happens then is any question that doesn't perform well, They call questions items. Any question or item comes back to subject matter experts, and they improve them, and they try to make the question perform better. If they can't do that, they take the question out and new ones are put in place. Certification bodies, there's 12 areas within the ISO standard that we need to comply with. And so there's our typical audit is about 3,000 pages of documents and 2 days of interviews with staff that happen. So what's important to also know is a lot of times on a certificate program, they make up the exam, and the exam can last for years. We had that as a crane company. We had some basic exams for like orientation. We made them up and they lasted 20, 30 years. That doesn't happen under certification, accredited certification. What happens there is the exams are only good for a limited period of time, and it might be the number of times they've been exposed, the number of times that they've been used, and that sort of stuff. So that is monitored, and also they make sure that the questions don't just get out there and people know it. So if you have an exam where somebody sits down with you, we often get this question, is they sit down and they say, why can't you give us the answers that we missed so we can study? Well, that's really a certificate. That's really training. That's really helping you learn. When you get to certification, it's about, do you know your stuff or not? And we can't expose that and help you learn that information because we're evaluating whether you know it or not. And so that's a big distinction between certification and certificate. So a certificate is really often we see this in the workplace. So there's things where you can watch a video, and at the end of it, you get a certificate. You can attend a class, and at the end of it, you get a certificate. You could take a little practice exam that they've trained you on and taught you about, and then you get a certificate. And so these are really attendance certificates, milestone certificates, and it really comes from the teacher who's trying to teach you about a certificate, the content for a certificate. That's totally different than a certification and that sort of thing. So often we see this offered by employers or training companies and that sort of thing. And so often or even in educational processes or other things. Once you get your degree from a school, then you've achieved your certificate, and then you don't need to go back and reapprove it every 5 years. You're good, you're golden. It's really a certificate at that point. So there are some really high-end certificate programs, and these are under the ASTM standard that is out there. There's another standard as well, but the ASTM is the main one. And this one is where they evaluate the body who's issuing the certificate, and they say, did your training match your learning objectives? And as long as your training matches your learning objectives, then you're golden, and that sort of thing. So the alignment of that the learners achieve the intending learning outcomes is really the important point there. And it's really about the scoring and the evaluation and how did they learn and get educated amongst those different elements. So, and that's really what you might hear of a third-party certificate program. That's really what it's talking about on the high end. So let's just do a little comparison here, just briefly, to walk through all of this information. So results from an assessment process really falls under the certification side. It's by a third party compared to awarded by a training or educational program. That's really important. I'm going to skip down to standards set are with a defensible industry-wide process. That's a really important topic to bring up. When you get a certification, what happens with that is CCO, in our case, we have made it defensible. So when you get cited by OSHA or you get cited by somebody else, they don't come back and ask us about what does the exam content include? Did you cover this area? Did you do this stuff? Because we are way above that. We are into the job task analysis side and that sort of thing. When you have a certificate, what happens at that point, OSHA can say, well, wait a minute, we want to look at your course because it's about learning and it's about learning content. And so what did they learn from you? What content did you give them? How did you educate them? How did you move through that process? And so for many organizations, they want to choose between certification and certificate. Some of them have chosen to do the defensible side because they don't want to have to argue how the exams were created or what the learning content was, or if the learning content was sufficient. Certification also has ongoing requirements, and as I indicated earlier, certificate doesn't. Once you achieve it, you achieve it. And the other one here to focus on is the last one, which is under certification, it can be taken away. So if you start doing things that are inappropriate, so for instance, let's say that you create a fraudulent card, or let's say that you have different, you have an accident where you went way outside of things, you can have your certification taken away. Whereas the certificate, once you've achieved the learning criteria or the attendance criteria, you've achieved that and you own it. And so there's no ongoing effort that you have to comply with the certification standard under a certificate. Under a certification, you do have to comply with those continuing standards and those sort of things. Okay, so let's bring in license because often license gets referenced. They say, oh, you got your CCO license or something like that. It's not a license. So let's walk through what a license is and how a license functions. And so it's a little bit nuanced, but it's important to understand the difference. So first off, licenses are governmental entities. And so they're issued by governmental entities, and they have a specific criteria that they want you to establish, that they've established, that says this person is proficient or competency or that sort of thing has been met. It's typically a mandatory thing to have in those areas that have said we want a license. So they can use certification programs and different programs to have as a test platform to ensure that. And so I'll give you an example. If I am a hairdresser and I need to have a license, to do that. There's not really a practical exam of I have to demonstrate I can cut 5 different people's hair in the appropriate way. But if I am going to be a crane operator in some of these states that have licensing, they actually recognize a CCO as the test platform for certification, but that doesn't get you the license. That's just one step. And after that, they want you to have their additional stuff. So for example, Washington State has crane inspector. And so the crane certifiers in Washington State need to have a CCO certification for their testing. And then they also need to turn in an application and turn in some resume and work history and stuff to Washington State. And then they choose from all of that they meet the standard. Usually there's a fee with this, and there is a designation, legal designation that happens on licensing. And so this is really an important area. So let's compare licensing to certification. So the certification is all the same as what we listed before, but licensing really results from the legal process. And it doesn't always include assessment. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it's like a business license. You don't need to say I'm good at business. I just get a business license. It's the same thing. It's a license is awarded by a governmental agency. They're the only ones that can create licenses and restrictions. And then the content is developed and maintained by the governmental agency or a delegate. And so there's times where they create their own exam and that sort of thing. And there's times where they'll rely on someone like CCO to create the exam. So ongoing requirements are normally for a license, where certification is focused on demonstrate that you continue to meet the assessment element of the certification. On license side, they really are focused on the renewal of the license. Did you get all your forms in? Is everything all marked right? Did you get your right stuff taken care of? Similarly to certifications, a license can be taken away. And we know that from different things that have occurred where entities or individuals have lost their license to do certain things to go forward. So those are one of the things to keep in mind with both license and certification. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how the different levels kind of work, because we had this ASME stuff and OSHA stuff where we had the competent, qualified, and certified tiers. I want to focus a little bit on the bottom down here about the qualification levels. So certified covers both qualified and certified because it has the word, all right? But certified is important that it covers both because it meets the standard of being able to demonstrate that they have the understanding, the knowledge, and the content applied to the situation. So that meets the qualified standard. It also meets the certified if you're certified. So often, and again, it's defensible. You don't get people diving into what was on the exam, what questions did they miss, that kind of thing. When you're at a certificate does meet the qualified standard, which is good, but it doesn't necessarily, it does not get you into certified. And it does open the door a little bit to what is on the exam. The last thing I'll add to that on the certificate is ASME has recently in the V30.5 standard has language that's going in that the certificate, the qualification is only good for 5 years. And so they're going to want to see that starting to get renewed. That'll be a change in the industry. That won't come out until the standard gets published in 2024. But that'll be something that's a year away where they want to start seeing every 5 years. And really what that's about is I could have had a qualification because TJ told you how many years I had in the industry, so it makes me feel really old. But I could have had a certificate qualification in 1990, right? That's pretty old. That doesn't mean that I know the new standards. It doesn't mean that I know the new things. And so that's really why ASME is making that change that will be effective in 2024, 2025. So that'll be something that'll be coming. So licensed, again, isn't part of the qualification. Do I know how to do the job? So it's really in its own box off to the side. You may have to be certified to be licensed. You may have to be qualified to have a license, or you may not have to have anything and just have the license. Again, the hairdresser kind of thing. So it's really those different levels. License is a whole nother element to that. Okay, so let's take that and put that over the top of crane world here for a moment and talk a little bit about the different responsibilities. So on your screen is the different roles and responsibilities that have been defined by both ASME and OSHA. Now, again, I will say crane industry is super unique to have these roles defined, the responsibilities defined in the standards. So when we all reference, you must meet industry safety standards, this is really what we're talking about. All of these roles are defined. Now, often people don't have these roles defined in their contract, And that's where some of the conflict stuff happens. And so it's important to identify these roles, who's going to be these roles, how that's going to work, and that sort of thing as you go forward. So on the left-hand side versus the right-hand side, the left-hand side, you don't have to have any qualification whatsoever to be a crane owner, thankfully, a crane user, and or a controlling entity site supervision. There's not a specific requirement to your qualification level within the crane standard. However, for lift director, crane operator, signal person, rigger, assembly, disassembly director, they all have specific requirements to do that. And so let's talk briefly about what those are. So under lift director, under OSHA, OSHA doesn't really reference lift director. They list it one time in their standard, but they listed it 44 times in the compliance guide. And so lift director came along after, to all fairness to OSHA, lift director came along after OSHA had written the crane rule and that sort of thing. So under OSHA, they just say it needs to be a qualified person. Under ASME, there's qualifications that are going to have a written requirement for a written exam, demonstration that they know certain content areas and those sort of things. Crane operator, under OSHA, the 1926 standard, the construction standard, talks about certified. It's the only one that talks about certified. CCO as an organization had a lot of certified operators well before 2018 that have, when this rule came into effect, that were certified. And the reason that we had that was, again, because of the defensible, because of the fairness in the test and those sort of things. Under ASME, it specifically says a written and a practical for a crane operator. And so it defines what you need to do there. For signal person, OSHA talks about qualified. It talks about a third-party kind of process, employer process. It gives a variety of different pathways, but they are all qualified based. The qualified under ASME talks about a written and a practical exam for signal person. The written could be audible in that scenario for signal persons, because sometimes they do audio signals and those sort of things. And so that could be done that way as well, and that sort of thing. Rigger has qualified under the OSHA standard overall, and it's also qualified in ASME with a written and a practical. The one interesting one at the bottom is the assembly disassembly director, and this is something that OSHA has created, and they ask that this person be qualified and competent. If it can't be one person who meets both those standards, then it's divided between two people, one who's qualified and one who's competent. And the person who's competent is responsible for leading the assembly disassembly because they have the ability to correct the hazards as they go along. ASME hasn't really touched the assembly disassembly director side. Lift director somewhat falls into those categories a little bit, but it's not a clearly defined role within ASME at this time. So that's kind of how it fits within the crane industry. I hope that we've kind of walked through the different areas and explained anything that you may have been wondering about, but happy to open it up for any questions. TJ, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was really informative. Appreciate that. So if you have any questions, any of the participants on the webinar today, feel free to put them into the chat or the Q&A, and we will ask those questions as we go. Looks like there's one question here. In the jurisdiction where I work, certification is the right to title, where licensing is the right to practice. Can you please comment on this assertion? So, and then it says, I believe we should be following certification processes as opposed to licensing. Thank you.
Yeah, so I would I can appreciate that comment. What I would say about it is twofold. So one is certification, again, is about the skills and the abilities to perform proficiently the position that's defined. Licensing is not at that level. Licensing is more about they rely on other analysis to occur and that sort of thing. It's more about getting every of the qualifiers in for the license and approval. So I think it's important that if there's a license area and it's for a high risk industry or a high risk position, that it should rely on have as a basis some competency evaluation exam that it relies on before it issues it.
Thank you. We have another question. What were the long OSHA references under the first couple slides for 1926?
I think TJ will probably make this PowerPoint available, and that sort of thing. And so I could travel back to those. I don't have those off the top of my head. I used to. So,
no problem. We will have everybody that's attending this will get registered for this. We'll get a recording, so you'll be able to go back through it and check that out for yourself.
They're all from the release of the final rule in 2010, and so that's where they all came from.
Great. So if there are some cases or some roles where where someone only needs to be qualified, why would they want to take the extra step, or why would they bother to take the extra step to get certified?
Well, I think there's probably two different reasons. So one is, let me take the employee perspective and then maybe the employer perspective. So from an employee perspective, I'd like to maybe differentiate myself, especially in a tight job market. I'd like to differentiate myself a little bit and say that I have this title. I've achieved this certification. That distinguishes me from other individuals. It's transportable. I can move from employer to employer. I can show, my certificate is good at employer X versus employer Y. So that's a good thing for me overall as an employee. As an employer, I really would want to have certification in over a certificate, because the certificates get into OSHA can open the box. They can ask about the exam. I've seen multiple cases where they've opened up the box and said, what's on the exam? And no, you didn't specifically train this person on this item. And so the legal defensibility of a certification is really a nice thing. And it's also recognized. You don't have to prove it to customers. It was always nice to be able to walk into a national company and that sort of thing, or a customer, and say, hey, we meet this international testing standard. We meet this national program. It's not my creation and my certificate that I created on my own, and you don't know if it's good or not. So from that standpoint, I think it's both good for the employer and the employee.
All right, that makes sense. So what kind of things should people do at their workplace to make sure that the people they're working with are meeting or under their supervision are meeting the requirements related to certain?
Yeah, so that's an important one too. So there's from a employer standpoint, or even from a consumer standpoint, I would want to make sure that the organization has maintained its accreditation. So the NCCCO Foundation has a great website that you can go in and find out, related to cranes, who is currently accredited, by what organization they're accredited. You don't have to go look through a whole bunch of stuff. It's right on their website. It's a great place to go. It's a good link, that sort of thing. And so that would be one step, is to make sure that your organization is accredited. How often should you look at that? Again, we get renewed annually. Their dates are on there on the website, and so you can understand which one is up at which cycle. If you have employees under one certification, you can know which one's up at which cycle and how they're doing and that sort of thing. So that would be one. The other thing I would highly recommend is to do verify. We have a verify CCO, and you can verify credentials of the employees and stuff with what we have on our database. I think that's important, especially as you get close to recertification cycles or those sort of things. But any time where an employee might have lost their certification, it'll be on the website. We now have QR codes that lead you directly to their VCO page and that sort of thing. And so I would, if you're sending out people, they're getting close to their expiration date, I'd be checking that, but I would probably randomly check it, like once a year kind of thing. Or if you're aware of any changes in employment status, or that they might have had an accident, or they might have had something, I keep a little closer eye on it. But those are the two good sources, I think, to review that.
Great, thanks. And so another question: if someone says they've been trained, and after the training, the company gave them a certificate, but they never actually took an exam. What else should they be? What else do they need to do in order to make sure that they're going to be in compliance?
Yeah, that's where OSHA gets you. That's the number one area where OSHA gets people right now. Is they come in and they ask, how did you qualify this individual? Well, they watched the video. How did they know that they watched the video? How did you know that they took the content in? How did you know that they learned from the content? And that's just a bad day from there on out. And so if they haven't taken exams, you really need to get to a place where the program should have an exam at a minimum. It needs to reflect that stuff. You need to protect the exams and make sure they don't get out to a lot of people. You don't use them as study guides. You don't give them to people to review before the exam. You don't let them fill them out during the video, those sort of things. You really need to be dividing that up. On certification side, it's easy because we don't do any of that, and that's the exam that we give them, and that sort of thing. But on the qualification side, that's one of the things you have to really look out for. So, I would just make sure that you have some type of evaluation that you meet that standard that's out there.
Great. We've got another question that's saying they're in California and asking which agency would they need to look at for the crane license process.
Yeah, so in California, California is a state plan state, which means they can be more restrictive, and they are. There's a number of items that they've done that are more restrictive than OSHA. And so the Cal OSHA codes and the regulations are really the most important. There's 4, but they are aligned on who can provide credentialing for certification of crane operators. They're aligned exactly with OSHA on that. And so you could rely on the CCO, the NCCCO Foundation website for who's accredited and that sort of thing. There are 4 organizations that are accredited to certify operators, for example. And so those 4 are all approved and go through the processes that I've talked about on this. But yeah, any of those 4.
Great, thank you. And then someone's asking if you can elaborate on the ASME upcoming changes, or potentially we provide where they could look into that more.
Yeah, so ASME goes through a process where the subcommittees have ballots and they create language for changes. And so this is a ballot that passed, and then the subcommittee, once they pass it at the subcommittee level, then it goes to the main committee level for approval. Once passed there, then it sits in a queue for publishing at the next publishing cycle. And so there is a change to the qualification period, where it needs to be at least at maximum every 5 years where they get requalified. And that language has already passed committee, subcommittee, and passed main committee, and is sitting in the queue for publication on the next cycle. And so the next cycle for B 30.5 is 2024, and then it will go into effect in 2025. And so I think at that point, it'll be part of the new publication that comes out in 2024.
Great, thank you. So that appears to be all the questions that we have. So before we sign off, I just want to ask everyone to keep an eye out for the future webinar announcements from the foundation. Our next webinar will be on July 27th. We'll provide tips on engaging and recruiting youth in the crane industry. Feel free to reach out to me and by email if you're interested or want to know more. Also, a brief survey about your experience today will be sent out soon. So please take some time to fill that out. We welcome your feedback. And thanks again to you, Tom, for your great presentation. Thanks to everyone for joining us for the Foundation's first webinar of the webinar series on this very important topic. And we appreciate you signing in. Hope you learned a lot. Well, take care. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.